The lead Panther should have rolled across the Salm at Trois-Ponts without slowing. That was the plan, at least, written in grease pencil on the map folded in Joachim Peiper's command half-track, a plan built on the assumption that a bridge standing at 9 that morning would still be standing at 11. Instead, the tank commander threw up a fist, the driver hauled on the brakes, and 80 tons of steel skidded to a stop at the lip of a smoking gap where the roadway used to be. The far bank sat maybe 40 feet away. It might as well have been the far side of the moon. Below, the Salm ran gray and swollen with December meltwater, and the stone piers that had held the span now ended in jagged air. The gap is worth being precise about, because everything else follows from it. The bridge came down at roughly 11:15 on the morning of the 18th of December, 1944, and Peiper's spearhead nosed up to it minutes later. The German accounts and the American engineer reports disagree on exactly how many minutes, and I'll take the tight number because the men who lit the fuse remembered it that way. If you enjoy the kind of history that lives in those minutes rather than in the textbook summary, do me a favor and hit like, drop a comment with the theater you want covered next, and subscribe so the algorithm stops burying this stuff. What happened at that gap wasn't luck, and it wasn't a lone hero in a helmet. It was a system arriving on time. Look at who was stopped. Kampfgruppe Peiper was the sharpened tip of the 6th Panzer Army, the unit Hitler had personally counted on to punch through the Ardennes, seize the fuel dumps, and be across the Meuse before the Americans woke up. Peiper commanded the best the Waffen-SS could field that winter: Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, veterans of the Eastern Front who had learned their trade against the Red Army and expected the Americans to fold the same way the French had in 1940. His timetable allowed no slack. Every hour of daylight burned, every mile not made, was fuel he didn't have and darkness he'd have to fight through. He needed bridges intact. His entire plan was a bet that he would move faster than the defenders could react, that he would reach each crossing before anyone thought to wreck it. At Trois-Ponts, 3 bridges met. The town is named for them, and the one over the Salm was the door to the whole valley beyond. Now expectation and reality peel apart. Peiper had every reason to believe that bridge would be his. American units in the sector were thin, scattered, in some places running. The men actually holding Trois-Ponts were not a combat regiment or a defensive line drawn up for a last stand. They were a company of combat engineers, plus a stray anti-tank gun crew that had wandered in the night before, a few dozen men against the most feared armored formation on the Western Front. By the arithmetic Peiper carried in his head, they should not have been able to stop him for 10 minutes. And yet, the bridge was gone, and gone in a way that no repair party could fix in time, because those engineers had done the one thing his timetable never accounted for. They had done their job faster than his tanks could arrive. The German after-action reasoning, reconstructed later from Peiper's own post-war interrogations, keeps circling back to a single sour word. The crossing was prepared, not defended, prepared. Somebody had wired that span with demolition charges before he ever got near it, and somebody had stayed at the plunger long enough to use them at the last possible second. Peiper turned his column south to try the next crossing at Stavelot, then east, hunting for any bridge the Americans hadn't gotten to first, and the detour cost him hours he would never recover. He was burning fuel he could not spare. The bet that had carried him this far, move fast, catch them sleeping, broke against a 40-foot gap over the Salm, and the men who opened that gap had a name, a number, and a very short window of time. Peiper had planned his war by the clock long before he reached the Salm. He had 125 kilometers to cover between the German start line and the Meuse, and he intended to cover the bulk of it in the first 2 days. That kind of pace assumes the roads stay open, the bridges stay up, and the enemy stays confused. It is a beautiful plan on paper. It has exactly one weakness, and the weakness has a shovel. The engineers holding Trois-Ponts belong to the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, with a company from the 291st close by, and I want to be clear about what those units were built to do. They were road builders. They graded surfaces, laid pontoon spans, cleared rubble, filled craters, kept the whole American war machine rolling by, making sure the trucks had somewhere to drive. Combat was not their trade. They carried rifles the way a carpenter carries a pocket knife. Useful, not the point. On the morning of the 18th, that changed by necessity, because they were the only Americans between Peiper's Panthers and the road west. Think about the mismatch for a second. On one side, the sharpened tip of the 6th Panzer Army, hundreds of vehicles, veterans who had killed their way across 2,000 miles of the Eastern Front. On the other, a few dozen men with rifles, a scattering of mines, some bazookas, and a single-toed anti-tank gun, crewed by strangers who'd rolled into town the night before and decided to stay. By every measure that armies use to predict a fight, this was not a fight. It was a formality. Peiper's tanks would arrive, brush the engineers aside, and roll across the bridge onto open ground. The engineers understood the arithmetic as well as anyone, and they understood the one thing it left out. You do not have to beat a tank to stop it. You only have to take away the thing it needs, and what Peiper needed, above everything, was that bridge intact. A road builder knows better than anyone how hard a bridge is to replace and how easy it is to drop. The same expertise that let them throw a span across a river in hours, let them read exactly where to place the charges that would put one at the bottom of it. So while Peiper's clock ran down, the engineers went to work on the only weapon that mattered. They rigged the bridges over the Salm and the Amblev with demolition charges, ran the wires, and set men to wait beside the plungers. Then, they built the thing an armored column hates most. A roadblock, mines across the approach, the anti-tank gun sighted down the road, where the first Panther would have to show itself. It was not a defense meant to hold. It was meant to buy the 10 or 15 minutes it takes to be sure the tanks are committed before you send the bridge into the river. Peiper's men hit that roadblock, and the gun opened up. The details of the exchange are thin in the records. One American gun against the point of a Panzer division does not generate much paperwork on the American side, because most of the men who could have written it down did not survive the morning. The crew fired, hit at least one vehicle, and were overrun. They bought their minutes with their lives, and those minutes were what the man at the plunger needed. The Germans, sorting through it all afterward, kept coming back to their own astonishment at who had done this to them. In the post-war interrogations, Peiper described being held up not by a strong force, but by engineers. The word carries a sneer in the transcript, the professional contempt of a tankman for the people who fix roads. He had been stopped by ditch diggers. It galled him. It also, by his own account, wrecked his timetable, because the detour around a blown bridge is measured in hours, and he had budgeted his fuel in minutes. That is the thing his stopwatch never accounted for. The Americans he dismissed as laborers understood his clock better than he did, and they knew that the surest way to steal an hour from a man in a hurry is to take away his bridge 9 seconds before he reaches it. The load list for a single engineer squad's truck ran to crates of blasting caps, spools of 2-wire firing cable, primacord, and boxes of half-pound TNT blocks stacked like bricks in a hardware store. That was the standard kit for building. 12 tons of the stuff, roughly, spread across the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion in the second week of December. You could pour it into abutment forms, or you could pack it against a pier and turn a bridge into gravel. The battalion did both that week, and the man deciding which was a 27-year-old lieutenant colonel named David Pergrin. Pergrin commanded the 291st, and on paper, his battalion had a rear area job. Sawmill duty, road maintenance, running a rock quarry near Malmedy, the unglamorous plumbing of an army that was supposed to be finishing the war by spring. His companies were scattered across the Ardennes, at little towns whose names would soon appear in every history of the offensive: Malmedy, Stavelot, Trois-Ponts. On the morning of the 16th, when the German barrage opened and the reports started coming in garbled and contradictory, Pergrin was one of the few American commanders in the sector who did not wait for orders that were not coming. The chain of command had, in effect, dissolved. Units north and east of him were being overrun or pulled back. Radios carried rumor as often as fact, and higher headquarters had only the vaguest idea of where the German spearhead actually was. Pergrin figured it out the direct way. He drove toward the sound of the guns, talked to men streaming west, and on the 17th got close enough to hear the massacre of American prisoners in a field outside Malmedy, the shooting that the world would come to know as the Malmedy Massacre. His battalion sheltered survivors who came stumbling into their lines. He knew then, with a certainty the generals still lacked, that armor was loose in his rear and driving hard for the Meuse. A road-building battalion became a weapon at that point. Pergrin did not have the men to hold anything. What he had was demolition expertise, 12 tons of explosives, and a map of every bridge and defile on the roads Peiper had to use. So he strung his companies out along those roads, not as a line, but as a series of tripwires, each one wired to blow. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Figure out which crossings the Panzers must take, get to each one first, and rig it so the last American standing there could drop it into the river the instant the tanks committed. Company A went toward Malmedy and the Amblève crossings, while Company C moved on Trois-Ponts and the Salm. Small parties, a squad or two at each site, carrying more TNT than rifles. They were not defending the towns. They were preparing to destroy the roads through them. The genius of it was that Peiper had almost no choices. The Ardennes in December is not open-tank country. It is steep, wooded, laced with rivers, and the armor is chained to a handful of hard roads and the bridges that carry them. Take away the bridges, and 80 tons of Panther becomes 80 tons of scrap sitting at a riverbank. Pergrin's engineers, the men who spent their careers studying exactly how those roads and bridges fit together, understood the terrain as a cage. All they had to do was shut the doors in the right order. The battalion's own combat record puts the intent plainly, describing the mission as denying the enemy the use of the road net. Dry engineer language for a decision that helped derail the entire northern shoulder of the offensive. Pergrin did not phrase it as heroism. He phrased it as a work order. By nightfall on the 17th, the tripwire was strung. At Trois-Ponts, the men of Company C were laying their charges against the Salm bridge and sighting that lone anti-tank gun down the approach, doing the arithmetic on how many minutes they could steal. Miles up the road, Peiper's column was grinding forward in the dark, burning fuel, still believing the crossings ahead were his for the taking. 2 clocks were running now, and only one side knew it. The engineers had already decided the bridge would not be there when he arrived. All that remained was the timing. Stavelot came first, and Stavelot nearly went the other way. The town sits on the north bank of the Amblève, and to reach it Peiper's column had to come down a steep twisting road, cut into the hillside above the river, then cross a stone bridge into the streets. On the night of the 17th, the American presence at that bridge amounted to a handful of men, a small engineer detachment, and a scattering of stragglers, nowhere near enough to hold a town against a Panzer division. They knew it. They laid a hasty roadblock of mines across the approach road above the bridge and waited in the dark, listening to engines grinding down the grade toward them. What happened next was almost comedy, if you can find comedy in it. Peiper's point vehicle rolled onto the mines in full darkness, and the lead half-track was disabled with a crack that echoed off the valley walls. The Germans, unsure how many Americans were up there in the black, and unwilling to feel their way down a mined road into an unknown force at night, did the cautious thing. They stopped. The tip of the most aggressive armored formation on the Western Front sat on a hillside above Stavelot for the better part of the night, because a few engineers had scattered mines across a road and made the darkness seem full of teeth. That pause bought hours. It was not a battle. It was a bluff backed by a handful of explosives, and it worked because Peiper could not afford to lose tanks to a night ambush he could not see. Daylight ended the bluff. At dawn on the 18th, Peiper's tanks came down the grade hard, machine guns hammering the houses along the river, and the thin American line at the bridge could not stop 80 tons of Panther, moving with purpose. The Germans forced the Stavelot bridge and pushed into the town. What still irritates me when I read the accounts is that the American engineers had wired that bridge too, or meant to, and it did not come down in time. The span survived. Peiper got his crossing over the Amblève at Stavelot, and for a few hours it looked as though the whole tripwire scheme had failed at the first river. Then, the thing that saves the story happened, and it happened because of what Peiper did next, rather than what the Americans did. With Stavelot behind him and the bridge intact, Peiper had a choice of routes west. He drove hard for Trois-Ponts, because the road through Trois-Ponts was the fast road, the direct line toward the Meuse. He did not garrison Stavelot in strength. He did what a man on a stopwatch does. He left a screen and pushed the bulk of his combat power forward, chasing the timetable, betting that speed mattered more than securing the ground behind him. It was an aggressive call, and by the logic of his own plan, the correct one. It also meant his spearhead was now racing toward Trois-Ponts, stretched out along a single road, fuel gauges dropping, the head of the column far ahead of anything that could support it. That is the column the tank commander was riding at the front of when the Salm bridge went up in his face. Stavelot had cost Peiper a night and then given him a crossing, and the crossing had lured him forward fast and thin toward the next river, where a different squad of engineers was crouched beside a plunger, doing the same arithmetic the Stavelot men had done, only this time with the wires connected and the timing right. You can feel the pattern tightening across those 2 mornings. At Stavelot, the engineers delayed him with a bluff in the dark, lost the bridge in daylight, and still came out ahead, because the delay was worth more than the span. The mission was never to hold. It was to make a man in a hurry, spend time he did not have, and even the failures fed the plan, because every hour Peiper burned at one river left him hungrier and more strung out at the next. Company A's men who scattered those mines above Stavelot never saw Trois-Ponts. They did their part in the dark and were gone before the real trap sprang. 40 feet of empty air over the Salm. The cold at Trois-Ponts came up off the water and settled in the hands, and hands were what the whole thing depended on. It was raw work in a December river valley, fingers on cold cable, on the metal of blasting caps, on TNT blocks, stiff and unforgiving in the dark. The men of Company C had been at it since the night before, packing charges against the bridge over the Salm, running the 2-wire firing line back to a spot where a man could crouch and see the approach and still reach the detonator. You do not rush that kind of work, and you do not do it well with numb fingers, and they had no choice but to do both. They had almost nothing else. A squad of engineers, a few dozen infantry stragglers who had drifted into town, and that single-toed anti-tank gun with a scratch crew, a 57mm piece manned by men who happened to be passing through and stayed. Set against Peiper's Kampfgruppe, it was a joke, but set against Peiper's schedule, it was enough. Then the sound arrived. Anyone who has stood in a river valley knows how it carries engine noise, folds it against the hills, and throws it back magnified, so that armor 2 miles off sounds like it is already in the streets. The men wiring the Salm bridge heard Peiper's column before they saw it. The grind of tracks and the deep thudding of tank engines rolling down toward them from the direction of Stavelot, growing steadily louder against the water. It is a pressure that gets into the fingers. Your job is to finish the wiring correctly, and the thing the wiring is meant to stop is announcing itself louder by the minute, and you cannot make the cold cable move any faster than it wants to. The arithmetic they had rehearsed now ran for real. Blow the bridge too soon, and Peiper simply detours, loses an hour, comes at you fresh from another angle. The charge is wasted. Blow it too late, and a Panther is on the span when it goes, or worse, already across, and then it does not matter what you drop into the river. The whole plan lived in the seam between those two mistakes, a window of seconds that opened only once the lead tanks had committed to the approach and could not back out. So they waited with the plunger, listening to the engines get louder, and let the enemy come. The anti-tank crew held their fire until the point vehicles nosed into the roadblock, and then the 57 opened up down the length of the street. I have read the accounts of that gun and the men who worked it, and the records are thin the way they always are when nearly everyone at the sharp end dies. A few lines, a claim of a hit, then silence. What is certain is that the gun fired, that it drew Peiper's attention and his fire, and that it forced the head of the column to slow and deal with it. That slowing was the whole reason the gun was there. Every second the Germans spent reducing one American gun was a second the man at the detonator did not have to guess about whether the tanks were committed. The gun crew paid for those seconds. Most of them did not walk away from that street. The tanks pushed through, machine guns and cannon tearing into the town, and the lead Panther swung toward the Salm bridge and the open road beyond it. This was the moment the whole tripwire had been strung for. The engineers had built their war down to this single instant, not a battle, not a line held, one span and one plunger, and a man deciding when. The lead tank rolled onto the approach. An officer of the 51st Engineers later described the timing with the flatness of a man who still could not quite believe it worked, saying the charge fired with the German armor right there, almost on top of the bridge. The exact count is one of those numbers that shifts between tellings. Some say seconds, some stretch it, but every version agrees on the essential thing. The Panther was close enough to see the far bank when the far bank stopped existing. The Salm bridge went up in front of Peiper's face, and 125 kilometers of timetable dropped into the river with it. On the west bank of the Salm, low behind a wall or a heap of masonry, the accounts do not agree on exactly where the man crouched. The demolition was in the hands of one soldier, watching the approach through the noise. He had the firing device in front of him, and the two wires running back across the open ground to the charges packed against the span. Everything the battalion had done for 2 days narrowed to this. The road net per grin meant to deny. The delay banked at Stavelot. The seconds bought by the 57mm gun, and the men who died working it. All of it came down to when this one soldier decided to close the circuit. The Panther came onto the approach with its bowgun still working, tracks throwing up the frozen grit of the roadway, the driver holding the throttle open, because that is what you do when the bridge ahead is still standing, and the road beyond it runs clear to the Meuse. From the west bank, the tank was no longer a sound in the valley. It was a shape filling the near end of the span, close enough to make out the mud on the running gear, close enough that a mistake now could not be corrected. He waited past the point most men would have fired. I keep coming back to that. Every instinct in a man watching 60 tons of armor roll toward him says fire now, get it done, do not let it reach you. Fire a heartbeat early, and Peiper backs off, finds a ford, spends an hour, and keeps his tank. The whole scheme demanded that the soldier at the plunger override the oldest instinct there is and let the enemy come closer than any sane man would allow, until the Panther was committed to the crossing and could not reverse off it in time. He held. He watched the tank crest the approach with the far bank in its sights, and only then did he fire the charge. The bridge over the Salm went up under the nose of the lead tank. The blast threw the span into the river in a single convulsion of stone and water and shattered decking, and where a road had run to the west bank, there was suddenly 40 feet of empty air over cold water. The Panther that had been about to cross stopped at the lip of nothing. Behind it the column stacked up on the near bank, tanks and half-tracks and fuel-hungry Panthers strung back through Trois-Ponts, all of them now pointed at a river they could not cross on the road they needed. Accounts of the interval settle on 9 seconds, the gap between the lead tank reaching the bridge and the charge firing. 9 seconds is not a figure of speech here. It is the difference between a Panther on the west bank driving for the Meuse and a Panther sitting on the east bank with nowhere to go. Think about what that number means. A man let an enemy tank get 9 seconds from crossing, on purpose, because 8 seconds would have wasted the bridge and 10 would have put armor on his side of the river. He threaded a needle whose eye was measured in single seconds, under fire, with numb hands, watching the thing that would kill him grow larger in front of his face, and he got it right. Peiper stood at the head of his column and looked at a gap where his fast road had been. The direct route to the Meuse through Trois-Ponts was gone, dropped into the Salm in front of him, and every kilometer he now had to add to reach another crossing was a kilometer of fuel he did not have, and time his stopwatch had never budgeted. He turned his spearhead north, onto the smaller road along the Amblève, toward Cheneux and Gleize, into narrower country and worse ground, and waiting up that road, another blown bridge and the American air power that found columns caught on open roads. The demolition on the Salm did not stop him where he stood. It bent his whole axis away from the objective and sent him grinding into terrain that would finish what the engineers started. One man at one plunger held for 9 seconds. The bridge that was supposed to carry a Panzer division to the Meuse was at the bottom of the river, and Peiper never got it back. By the 19th of December, Peiper's northern detour had carried him along the Amblève into a bowl of ground that looked, on the map, like progress, and, on the terrain, like a trap. Gleize sits in a valley pocket, hills rising on both sides, one main road in and one main road out, the sort of place a fast column races through and never wants to stop in. Peiper stopped in it. The road ahead had its own blown bridge waiting. The crossing at the Amblève near Cheneux went the same way the Salm bridge had gone, into the river before his tanks could use it, and behind him, the Americans had begun to seal Stavelot he had left ungarrisoned. The bowl closed slowly, and then all at once. His problem was no longer terrain, or even the guns closing on the ridgelines. His problem was that his tanks were running out of things to burn. The Panther and the King Tiger drank fuel at a rate the German supply system could not sustain over normal roads, let alone the extra kilometers the engineers had forced onto him. Peiper's whole plan had been built on capturing American fuel dumps intact along the way. He never reached the big one at Spa. The stalls at the rivers cost him the hours, and the hours cost him the fuel. And now 60-ton tanks sat in a valley as immovable as buildings. The German side of these days is not lost to guesswork. After the war, the U.S. Army sat down a number of captured German commanders and had them write out, in their own words, what had happened and why. The Foreign Military Studies series, hundreds of manuscripts filed away in the historical division. Peiper himself, held prisoner, produced accounts of the Ardennes drive. There is no bluster about the bridges in them. He writes as a professional soldier, itemizing delays, listing fuel he did not get, describing a timetable that came apart at the crossings. The man's own post-war words are the confession the whole story needed. The ace of the SS explaining on American paper why he never reached the Meuse. The German record and the American record agree on the arithmetic, and the arithmetic says rivers and fuel, not firepower. The American guns did the rest. Artillery ranged the valley and worked it over, and Peiper's men, low on fuel and ammunition, dug into the stone houses of Gleize and took it. There was no more racing. The vibration of tank engines gave way to the concussion of shell fire walking through the town. The crack of it off the valley walls, the same sound the Stavelot mines had made in the dark, only now it did not stop. King Tigers that had been meant to slice through to the Meuse became fixed strongpoints, then targets, then wreckage. By the 23rd, the situation in the pocket was finished, and Peiper knew it. He made the only choice left to a man whose vehicles could no longer move. He abandoned them. Peiper ordered his surviving men to destroy or leave behind the tanks, the half-tracks, the King Tigers, the whole armored spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army, and slip out of the pocket on foot in the dark toward the German lines. The spearhead that had crossed the start line as the most powerful armored column on the Western Front walked out of Gleize as roughly 800 men on foot, carrying what they could, leaving the tanks standing in the snow with their fuel tanks dry. The Americans who came into Gleize afterward found the vehicles intact and empty, Panthers and king tigers sitting in the streets and along the road, undamaged by any shell, simply out of gas and abandoned. Some of them still sit in that country today. One king tiger left in the town as a monument to what happened there. That is the finish the engineers on the Salm never saw. The man who held 9 seconds at Trois-Ponts had no way of knowing his bridge fed directly into this, a valley, a fuel gauge on empty 60-ton tanks left standing in the snow. He bent Peiper's axis. Gleize is where the bend ran out of road, and the ace of the SS walked home without his division. The paper smells like old libraries now. The FMS manuscripts in the archives, typescript gone brown at the edges, some of it carbon copies so faint you tilt the page to the light to read it. That is what the verdict looks like 60 and 70 years on. Not a panther in a valley, but a stack of translated German prose in a folder, filed under a study number, written by the men who lost. You go looking in it for the thing you expect from beaten commanders, the excuse, the weather, the enemy's numbers. It is not what they wrote. What the German officers wrote over and over was that the bridges did it, not the American tanks. The Sherman was outgunned by the Panther, and everyone in both armies knew it. And no German account of the Ardennes claims Peiper was stopped by superior armor, because he was not. He was stopped by gaps in the road where crossings used to be. The men who filed those reports for the U.S. Army Historical Division were professionals dissecting their own defeat, and professionals do not lie to the after-action file about what killed them. The file is where you tell the truth, so the next man does not repeat your mistake. They itemize the demolitions. They name the delays. They totaled the fuel those delays cost, and the total came out the same every time. Read enough of it, and a strange thing happens. You start to feel the respect leaking through the German prose, the reluctant kind, an officer describing an enemy he underestimated and then could not get past. They had crossed the start line, expecting to brush aside rear area troops. They ran instead into engineers who read Peiper's clock better than his own staff did and spent it down to 0-1 bridge at a time. Peiper's own post-war account carries it plainly. Interrogated as a prisoner, made to reconstruct the drive, he laid the failure on the terrain and the demolitions and the fuel, the crossings that were gone when he reached them, the kilometers those gaps forced onto tanks that were already thirsty. He did not blame the men under him, and he made no claim to have outfought the Americans, gun for gun. The ace of the 6th Panzer Army wrote out, in effect, that a handful of American engineers with truckloads of TNT had beaten the best armored spearhead Germany put into the field that winter. Sit with that a moment. The most feared tank commander on the Western Front, the man Sepp Dietrich handed the sharpest point of the whole offensive, spent his captivity explaining to his interrogators that he was defeated by the timing of demolition charges. This is the enemy's own verdict, in the enemy's own hand, and it is worth more than any American after-action report could ever be, because a beaten man has no reason to flatter the enemy who beat him. He is simply telling you what stopped him. What stopped Peiper was a plunger and 9 seconds and cold fingers on a firing device at Trois-Ponts. I said early on that the surest way to steal an hour from a man in a hurry is to take away his bridge 9 seconds before he reaches it. The German documents are where that stops being a phrase and becomes arithmetic. Every hour Peiper lost at a river was fuel. His tanks burned idling and detouring, and the fuel ran out in a valley called Gleize, and the spearhead walked home on foot. The line runs straight from the man at the Salm plunger to the king tigers standing empty in the snow, and the Germans drew that line themselves in their own reports without any American holding their hand. The names on our side stayed small. Pergrin's Battalion, Company A above Stavelot, Company C at the Salm, a scratch anti-tank crew, one soldier at one detonator, whose name in the telling shifts and blurs the way these things do when the men who could confirm it are gone. They do not get monuments the size of the thing they stopped. The king tiger in Gleize is bigger than any marker they were given. But the verdict that matters is not carved anywhere. It sits in a folder of brown typescript, written by the men who were beaten, admitting the thing they could barely stand to admit, that the road to the Meuse was closed not by armor, but by engineers who took away the bridges 9 seconds before the tanks arrived. The unit was the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, and the phrase that stuck to it did not come from an American after-action report. It came from the Germans. In the tellings that grew up around Trois-Ponts and Stavelot and Malmedy, the engineers of the 291st became the damned engineers, a curse, not a compliment, spoken by men who kept running into the same battalion, blowing the same kind of bridge in front of the same kind of tank. The title carries an irony worth stating. An American combat engineer of 1944 was trained to do two opposite things with equal speed. He built roads, bridges, culverts, the whole plumbing that let an army move, and he destroyed the same roads, bridges, and culverts to deny them to an enemy in a hurry. The doctrine that produced Pergrin's Battalion treated demolition as a branch of construction, taught by the same manuals, carried on the same trucks, in the same crates of TNT and primacord. A man who spent Tuesday laying a treadway across a stream could spend Wednesday dropping a stone span into a river, and the army considered these the same trade. That is what the Germans never quite reckoned with. They had engineers too, good ones, and their pioneers built and blew with the best of them. What the Wehrmacht did not expect was that the rear area laborers they dismissed, the men with shovels, the road gangs, the units that were supposed to be busy grading gravel while the real fighting happened somewhere ahead, would stand at the crossings and fight. Peiper's plan assumed those men would run. Some did. The 291st did not, and the difference between those two outcomes was measured in a Panzer division walking home on foot. The battalion did not vanish after the Bulge. It went back to the work it was built for, which by 1945 meant building rather than blowing. When the American armies reached the Rhine, the 291st was among the engineer units throwing bridges across it under fire. The same men, the same doctrine, now running the film in reverse, putting spans up as fast as they had once dropped them. Build, destroy, build again, all one trade. David Pergrin came home a lieutenant colonel, went back to civilian life, and lived a long time. Decades later, he wrote it down. The battalion's war, the days on the Amblève and the Salm, the men by name where he could name them. He was the source a great deal of this story came through, an officer sitting at a desk long after, reconstructing from memory and records what a scratch collection of engineers had done in a week of December cold. Some of the details in his account are first-hand, some assembled from the men who were there. The gaps show. The name of the soldier who held 9 seconds at the Salm is one of the things that blurs in the retelling, and Pergrin was honest about the limits of what he could reconstruct. There is a detail that goes nowhere, and I like it anyway. The battalion's own history notes that the 291st had been in Europe only a matter of months before the Bulge, a unit still finding its feet, not some hardened outfit with a long combat record. Green troops, more or less, doing a veteran's job under the worst conditions the theater offered. That fact does not change the outcome. It is just worth knowing. The Malmedy massacre happened on Peiper's route on the 17th of December, and the 291st was among the units near that ground. It colors how the men of the battalion remembered what they were fighting. It does not belong to this section, and I will leave it where it belongs, in the record of that road. What Pergrin wanted understood, he said in his own words, and they make a better ending than anything I could put after them. Writing of his engineers and the roads they closed against Peiper's tanks, he put it this way: "We were not supposed to stop a Panzer division. We were engineers, but somebody had to hold those bridges, and we were the ones standing on them.